Today we are looking at Season 4. We are looking at which specs are looking to be strong options for Season 4, are looking to be meta. There is a positive vibe around them for the beginning of the next season because after all, after Blizzard announced the season, we are only 18 days away from the release. So we're going to be looking at role by role, taking a look at which specs are looking to be the strongest on release, how much balance tuning would we need to make each role way more varied and balanced for the season, and lastly the underdog, the dark horse, the hipster pick for each of the roles that might surprise in the season. And for the memes, why not, the spec with zero hope of having fun in the season. So let's start with the elephant in the room, the purple elephant in the room, which is the tank role, and with the very large elephant called Vengeance Demon Hunter. So we have noticed over time the massive dominance of Vengeance nearing Exodia level or even passing Exodia level of popularity. This is not really changing in Season 4. Now, Demon Hunters might not be Nobel Prize candidates, but they're not completely dumb, so Vengeance is not changing their tier set for Season 4. They have not yet gotten nerfed in Season 4. There is still hope, there is 18 days left, but for now they have not been, and they continue to have the biggest issue of all tanks, which is Illuminated Sigils. In the end, the strongest tank in Mythic Plus is the tank that can have the largest pulls while staying alive. And at the moment, having 2 charges of a AoE silence at the moment is too strong for tanks, and will continue to be just as strong in Season 4. If anything, even stronger, because Blizzard has added even more abilities that can be interrupted, and on top of that, the original Dragonflight dungeons have more overall abilities that can be interrupted. So this is, if anything, just making Vengeance even stronger in Season 4. So in terms of how much would we need the balancing to shake things up, well, in the tank's case, it's an extreme need. Don't even bother trying to buff all the other tanks to the level of Vengeance, like some midwits sometimes say. Just go in here and remove Illuminated Sigils, just add something else and not have this talent exist anymore, and you will have a much more balanced situation for tanks. When it comes to the zero hope pick, it would have to be Brewmaster Monk. They are not changing their tier set, so don't expect any surprises there. They have not been changed in tuning, and also, as we are about to see soon, Mistweaver is very popular as a healer, which makes it even less likely for a Monk tank to become popular in the next season. So stay away from Brewmaster if you want to play Mythic Plus. The hipster pick, the niche pick, the surprise pick could be Guardian Druid. We can't really put Prot Paladin as a surprise pick, really, because they are still quite popular overall, so the next in line would be Guardian. Guardian is going back to Season 2's tier set, hoping to reignite the state of Guardian when they had that tier set. Now, the spec is not nearly as strong as it was back then, it has been nerfed, and the power of that tier set is weaker, but they still are the closest one to Vengeance in terms of, allowing massive pools to be viable. So there is still the chance of Guardian Druid to, at the very least, become stronger and more viable than they have been this season, which is, not at all. Now, healers show us a much better picture of what matters a lot in Mythic Plus, which is the composition, the slotting in the right pieces in your comp. For example, we need a combat rest, we need a bloodlust, and then some minor things like, hey, we have a tank giving us 5% more magical damage, let's just bring only magical damage DPS, etc, etc. This is showing up very well when it comes to healers because Mistweaver Monk is the popular pick right now. But they're not just popular because they are strong, they're also popular because they're being helped by some of the DPS. Particularly Ret and Shadow. They're being helped by Ret and Shadow because, generally speaking, unless something terrible happens, you very rarely have two specs of the same class in the same Mythic Plus composition. It's quite normal, for example, to see even here a zigzag of a Priest DPS and a Priest Healer, as well as a Druid Healer and a Druid DPS. You will see whenever there is a Druid Healer, there is no Druid DPS. When there is a Healing Priest, there is no DPS Priest. Druid Healer, Priest DPS. Priest Healer, Druid DPS. You have another Priest Healer with a Druid DPS, and then you have triple Healing Druid with triple DPS Priest. It's just not nearly as likely to simply double up on the same class, because they would be bringing the same things. The same Master Spell, the same Mind Suit, for example, whereas you could have just brought this one to give you, for example, Mark of the Wild. So this indirectly helps Mistweaver, because now they don't have to worry as much about discipline like in the start of the season when Shadow was terrible, when now Shadow is good and discipline has been losing popularity over time. Similarly, Holy Paladin started out reasonably decently when Red Paladin was a meme, and then Red Paladin grew out of control and now there is no more Holy Paladins. And also back to what we said about Brewmaster and why it's unlikely they will be a popular pick, because now you have Mistweaver. So with Mistweaver in this state, not just Brewmaster actually, but also Windwalker are going to be very unlikely to actually just be played. And as an extension, with these specs being very popular, it's unlikely for these healers to actually become played in the next season. So Mistweaver is the easy option for Season 4, followed by Restoration Druid. Restoration Druid is bringing combat res. There is Red Paladin, sure, but especially for very high keys, as you might have noticed already, there are not nearly as many Red Paladins. In fact, there are way more balanced Druids in keys in the 30 plus range of key level. So that is still also a pretty good option as a healer, and also as a DPS. Both of them are actually pretty popular in high key levels. So the meme pick, abandon all hope, those who enter, is definitely Holy Paladin. If we mix the popularity of Ret and even the popularity of Prot, which it might look terrible here, because these are like 27 plus keys, but if we go back to, you know, general key levels, Prot Paladin is still a popular tank. So Holy Paladin has to fight not just with one, but with two popular specs. So, you know, zero hope for them to actually become popular in Season 4. The hipster pick that might surprise is a duo. It's the Bloodlust duo of Preservation and Restoration Druid. They are both changing their tier set. Both of them are going back to their Season 1 version of their tier set. Especially Resto Shaman, they don't really have that much competition with Enhancement and Elemental as a Shaman pick in your group, and even Preservation. If Augmentation continues to dwindle in popularity in Season 4, they might have a chance to go under the radar and become a solid pick. Definitely more than Holy Paladin. And lastly, the requirements for balance tuning when it comes to healers is actually rather low. There isn't really much you can change to drastically change the power of healers. As mentioned, it's more about the slotting in together of all of the specs. For example, you would make Discipline Priest much more viable in Mythic Plus if you deleted Shadow Priest from the game, without even buffing Discipline itself. So the need for balance tuning in the healer department is much lower than for the tanks. And lastly, of course, we have our roulette of DPS options for Mythic Plus. Now, let's start with what is popular right now. In the lower level keys, although calling a 27 low, you know what I mean, it's Shadow, Ret, and Fire Mage right now. In the very highest of keys, Retribution Paladin loses out for a combination of balance or augmentation. What is interesting is that Ret is keeping their tier set, and so is Aug, but balance is changing, going back to Season 1, Fire is changing, going back to Season 2, and Shadow is changing, also going back to Season 2. So, first of all, we already have some significant changes in terms of power level based on the choices of tier sets. We still have to go back and compare the viable specs of other roles, as we have talked about, to see how many options these specs have to become popular. As said, Havoc, you know, ever since Vengeance became out of control, Havoc also has surprisingly lost its power level, even though we also mentioned it was partly, if not mostly, due to Red Paladin starting to easily outdamage Havoc Demon Hunter ever since a bit over a month ago. Red Paladin being far above Havoc has been the main source of Havoc Demon Hunter losing out its popularity. Similarly, as we mentioned for Mistweaver, Windwalker Monk is gonna have very few chances of being popular. There are some voices in the corridor in preliminary Season 4 sims with the new tier sets or the changed tier sets that Devastation, which we have to even struggle to pick out, is actually doing very well. It has one of the highest simming results. Their Season 2 set was very powerful. Before this Abomination was released, Devastation was actually doing decently well, and also very well in the raid with that tier set. The scaling of Devastation is quite good, with also even more so the power of that tier set, which is why Devastation is our hipster pick for Season 4. Now, you're wondering, but haven't we just talked about specs having a chance of becoming popular if they are not being blocked by another spec more popular than them, because groups don't like to run two of the same class? What would we make of Augmentation then? Well, Augmentation also is likely consistently going to get outscaled more and more in Season 4. That's because specs have more access to more and more versatility in Season 4, you know, weakening the effects of the DR given by Augmentation. You also have Augmentation scaling absolutely terribly, as most of their scaling comes from Mastery, and by this point in the season, they are already in the 5th tier of the diminishing returns for Mastery, so the values become weaker and weaker for that secondary stat. And don't forget the power of the bullions. The bullions in Season 4 will allow virtually every single DPS by week 2 to have Fyrax Rageheart plus Ward of Faceless Ire equipped. These two are some insanely powerful, especially since you will be able to boost them up to max item level, 528 item level, massive defensive power to pretty much everyone. This part right here will also significantly weaken Augmentation. The fact that pretty much everyone now, even the squishiest of shits like a Beast Mastery Hunter, can actually show up with a double absorb trinket for themselves. Yes, of course, the damage is going to be weakened because you're losing DPS trinkets, but we have already established, especially in this entire expansion, that the most important part of a key is to stay alive. The timers are very lenient. It's not nearly as difficult to time keys with your damage anymore. It's harder to just actually finish the key because you can stay alive. We have already seen, even in this season, multiple keys being timed like at Aldazar with 3, 4 or 5 minutes left in the key. So the question is, why don't they go to a 32 or why don't they go to a 33 if they can finish with 4 minutes left? Because the problem aren't the minutes remaining, the problem is that in one level higher they get one shot. They cannot stay alive. So having a bullion system giving you massive defensives in Season 4 will inadvertently also nerf the value of Augmentation. That's why we still think that Devastation could be doing well and not worry too much about the power and the presence of Augmentation in the season. However, Augmentation, much like every other spec that brings a Bloodlust, still has a problem. The problem is called Mage. Fire Mage in particular. They are changing their tier set back to Season 2, which is not nearly as combustion reliant but makes their rotation much smoother, with Phoenix Flames being way more available. They have not been nerfed in the tuning yet, so there is still no reason to expect Fire Mage to become any weaker, right? So they are still the premier pick. That's why we are talking about Devastation as an underdog, as a hipster pick, because definitely the #1 option for your Bloodlust delivery system in Season 4 is still going to be Mage. As for the specs with no hope, well, we can just extend what we just said about the popular specs right here. So, with Mistweaver being in this state, very little hope for Windwalker. With Vengeance being in this state, Havoc will lose more and more value in the next season. With Restoration being super popular, Balance Druid makes it by because of their very high power in very high keys, where you can make mega pulls and allow them to scale and ramp their AoE damage, so that's passable. But Feral Druid, which There you go, Feral Druid is going to be essentially doomed. Obviously, with Fire Mage in this state, Arcane and Frost are also going to be suffering much more. We can put, however, an asterisk, you know, a parenthesis in this for this meta of Season 4. The Dragonflight dungeons, so we're talking about the default 8 dungeons we have in Dragonflight, are the ones with the highest amount of interrupts required across the seasons we have had. So if you go and pick dungeons like Vortex Pinnacle, dungeons like Everbloom, compare them to the default Dragonflight dungeons, they have fewer requirements of interrupts, you know, stops, more crowd controls like disorients or stuns required. Also, from the dungeon tuning we have received, Blizzard even added 2 or 3 extra spells that can be interrupted as well inside the Dragonflight dungeons. So you could have specs losing some value, like for example Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest traditionally has a terrible interrupt, very long cooldown, and even worse stops, as they pretty much only have one Psychic Scream. Fire Mage is also not too good either. They have a single, also rather long interrupt, and their main stop, also Dragon Breath, is just about as bad as a Psychic Scream. So in a season with way more interrupts required, melee specs of course might be gaining more value. Traditionally popular melee specs like Rogue, for example, could be gaining more value simply because of how much more effective they can be at stopping and interrupting the enemies. It's not that we are expecting anything changing in the spec itself. For example, Outlaw. Outlaw is not changing tier set, Outlaw is not getting buffed, but their current state already isn't awful. Outlaw has been, even though we haven't mentioned it yet, has been a consistent 10%er pretty much the entire season. Also, even in the very highest of keys, you still have, you know, a couple of options for an Outlaw Rogue to sneak in here and there quite often. Perhaps actually it is even matching or passing a Red Paladin in terms of popularity as well. So in a season with more stops required and more interrupts required, Outlaw might be gaining even more value compared to this season. As to the necessity of balancing and balance tuning requirements for the DPS, well, the answer here is almost unlimited. Blizzard could be buffing significantly Unholy, they could be buffing Frost, they could be buffing Survival, both of the Warrior specs, Enhancement and Elemental Shaman, all 3 of the Warlock specs, Marksmanship Hunter as well. So the options here for last minute balance tuning buffs that could impact the meta, so to speak, in Season 4 are of course very, very high. When it comes to the DPS, definitely the most impactful of the balance tuning that can come is in the DPS department for Season 4. So with just 2.5 weeks remaining for the launch of the season, that's what we have to be waiting for. Any possible additional balance tuning from Blizzard, which should come, 1 or perhaps a couple rounds of balance tuning before the launch of the season. But for now, this is what is likely going to be the situation when looking at the meta for Season 4, particularly, as mentioned, focused around Mythic Plus, due to, you know, the raids being more or less a meme in the next season. So, with this recap out of the way, you guys are of course welcome to point out your own takes on what do you think are going to be the default picks for the next season. Awaiting, of course, any possible last-minute surprise changes from Blizzard and their balance tuning. But for today, on this Friday, it's time to leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters, as well as of course anyone who is supporting completely for free, liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as of course subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with this cantankerous things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I had to record this video desyncing myself with the neighboring barking dog. I speak, he's quiet, and then he barks, I wait, and then I speak again. Nice combo.